Chapter 29. Gilbert and Anne Disagree. Gilbert laid down the ponderous medical tome over which he had been poring until the increasing dusk of the March evening made him desist. He leaned back in his chair and gazed meditatively out of the window. It was early spring, probably the ugliest time of the year. Not even the sunset could redeem the dead, sodden landscape and rotten black harbor ice upon which he looked. No sign of life was visible, save a big black crow winging his solitary way across a leaden field. Gilbert speculated idly concerning that crow. Was he a family crow, with a black but comely crow wife awaiting him in the woods beyond the glen? Or was he a glossy young buck of a crow on courting thoughts intent? Or was he a cynical bachelor crow, believing that he travels the fastest who travels alone? Whatever he was, he soon disappeared in congenial gloom, and Gilbert turned to the cheerier view indoors. The firelight flickered from point to point, gleaming on the white and green coats of Gog and Magog, on the sleek brown head of the beautiful setter basking on the rug, on the picture frames on the walls, on the vaseful of daffodils from the window garden, on Anne herself, sitting by her little table, with her sewing beside her, and her hands clasped over her knee, while she traced out pictures in the fire, castles in Spain, whose airy turrets pierced moonlit cloud, and sunset bar ships sailing from the haven of Good Hopes straight to Four Winds Harbor with precious burden. For Anne was again a dreamer of dreams, albeit a grim shape of fear went with her night and day to shadow and darken her visions. Gilbert was accustomed to refer to himself as an old married man, but he still looked upon Anne with the incredulous eyes of a lover. He couldn't wholly believe yet that she was really his. It might be only a dream after all, part and parcel of this magic house of dreams. His soul still went tiptoe before her, lest the charm be shattered and the dream dispelled. "Anne," he said slowly, "lend me your ears. I want to talk with you about something." Anne looked across at him through the firelit gloom. "What is it?" she asked gaily. "You look fearfully solemn, Gilbert. I really haven't done anything naughty today. Ask Susan." "It's not of you or ourselves I want to talk. It's about Dick Moore." "Dick Moore?" echoed Anne, sitting up alertly. "Why, what in the world have you to say about Dick Moore?" "I've been thinking a great deal about him lately. Do you remember that time last summer I treated him for those carbuncles on his neck?" "Yes, yes." "I took the opportunity to examine the scars on his head thoroughly. I've always thought Dick was a very interesting case from a medical point of view. Lately I've been studying the history of trephining and the cases where it has been employed. Anne, I have come to the conclusion that if Dick Moore were taken to a good hospital and the operation of trephining performed on several places in his skull, his memory and faculties might be restored." "Gilbert!" Anne's voice was full of protest. "Surely you don't mean it." "I do indeed, and I have decided that it is my duty to broach the subject to Leslie." "Gilbert Blythe, you shall not do any such thing," cried Anne vehemently. "Oh, Gilbert, you won't, you won't. You couldn't be so cruel. Promise me you won't." "Why, Anne girl, I didn't suppose you would take it like this. Be reasonable." "I won't be reasonable. I can't be reasonable. I am reasonable. It is you who are unreasonable. Gilbert, have you ever once thought what it would mean for Leslie if Dick Moore were to be restored to his right senses? Just stop and think. She's unhappy enough now, but life as Dick's nurse and attendant is 1,000 times easier for her than life as Dick's wife. I know. It's unthinkable. Don't you meddle with the matter. Leave well enough alone." "I have thought over that aspect of the case thoroughly, Anne, but I believe that a doctor is bound to set the sanctity of a patient's mind and body above all other considerations, no matter what the consequences may be. I believe it is his duty to endeavor to restore health and sanity if there is any hope whatever of it." "But Dick isn't your patient in that respect," cried Anne, taking another tack. "If Leslie had asked you if anything could be done for him, then it might be your duty to tell her what you really thought. But you've no right to meddle." "I don't call it meddling. Uncle Dave told Leslie 12 years ago that nothing could be done for Dick. She believes that, of course." "And why did Uncle Dave tell her that, if it wasn't true?" cried Anne triumphantly. "Doesn't he know as much about it as you?" "I think not, though it may sound conceited and presumptuous to say it. And you know as well as I that he is rather prejudiced against what he calls these new-fangled notions of cutting and carving. He's even opposed to operating for appendicitis." "He's right," exclaimed Anne, with a complete change of front. "I believe myself that you modern doctors are entirely too fond of making experiments with human flesh and blood." "Rhoda Allonby would not be a living woman today if I had been afraid of making a certain experiment," argued Gilbert. "I took the risk and saved her life." "I'm sick and tired of hearing about Rhoda Allonby," cried Anne, most unjustly, for Gilbert had never mentioned Mrs. Allonby's name since the day he had told Anne of his success in regard to her. And he could not be blamed for other people's discussion of it. Gilbert felt rather hurt. "I had not expected you to look at the matter as you do, Anne," he said a little stiffly, getting up and moving towards the office door. It was their first approach to a quarrel. But Anne flew after him and dragged him back. "Now, Gilbert, you are not going off mad. Sit down here and I'll apologize beautifully. I shouldn't have said that. But, oh, if you knew—" Anne checked herself just in time. She had been on the very verge of betraying Leslie's secret. "Knew what a woman feels about it," she concluded lamely. "I think I do know. I've looked at the matter from every point of view, and I've been driven to the conclusion that it is my duty to tell Leslie that I believe it is possible that Dick can be restored to himself. There my responsibility ends. It will be for her to decide what she will do." "I don't think you've any right to put such a responsibility on her. She has enough to bear. She is poor. How could she afford such an operation?" "That is for her to decide," persisted Gilbert stubbornly. "You say you think that Dick can be cured. But are you sure of it?" "Certainly not. Nobody could be sure of such a thing. There may have been lesions on the brain itself, the effect of which can never be removed. But if, as I believe, his loss of memory and other faculties is due merely to the pressure on the brain centers of certain depressed areas of bone, then he can be cured." "But it's only a possibility," insisted Anne. "Now, suppose you tell Leslie and she decides to have the operation. It will cost a great deal. She will have to borrow the money or sell her little property. And suppose the operation is a failure and Dick remains the same. How will she be able to pay back the money she borrows or make a living for herself and that big helpless creature if she sells the farm?" "Oh, I know. But it is my duty to tell her. I can't get away from that conviction." "Oh, I know the Blythe stubbornness," groaned Anne. "But don't do this solely on your own responsibility. Consult Dr. Dave." "I have done so," said Gilbert reluctantly. "And what did he say?" "In brief, as you say, leave well enough alone. Apart from his prejudice against new-fangled surgery, I'm afraid he looks at the case from your point of view. Don't do it for Leslie's sake." "There now," cried Anne triumphantly. "I do think, Gilbert, that you ought to abide by the judgment of a man nearly 80, who has seen a great deal and saved scores of lives himself. Surely his opinion ought to weigh more than a mere boy's." "Thank you." "Don't laugh. It's too serious." "That's just my point. It is serious. Here is a man who is a helpless burden. He may be restored to reason and usefulness." "He was so very useful before," interjected Anne witheringly. "He may be given a chance to make good and redeem the past. His wife doesn't know this. I do. It is therefore my duty to tell her that there is such a possibility. That, boiled down, is my decision." "Don't say decision yet, Gilbert. Consult somebody else. Ask Captain Jim what he thinks about it." "Very well. But I'll not promise to abide by his opinion, Anne. This is something a man must decide for himself. My conscience would never be easy if I kept silent on the subject." "Oh, your conscience," moaned Anne. "I suppose that Uncle Dave has a conscience too, hasn't he?" "Yes, but I am not the keeper of his conscience." "Come, Anne, if this affair did not concern Leslie, if it were a purely abstract case, you would agree with me. You know you would." "I wouldn't," vowed Anne, trying to believe it herself. "Oh, you can argue all night, Gilbert, but you won't convince me. Just you ask Miss Cornelia what she thinks of it." "You're driven to the last ditch, Anne, when you bring up Miss Cornelia as a reinforcement. She will say, 'just like a man,' and rage furiously." No matter. This is no affair for Miss Cornelia to settle. Leslie alone must decide it." "You know very well how she will decide it," said Anne, almost in tears. "She has ideals of duty, too. I don't see how you can take such a responsibility on your shoulders. I couldn't." "'Because right is right to follow right, were wisdom in the scorn of consequence,'" quoted Gilbert. "Oh, you think a couplet of poetry a convincing argument," scoffed Anne. "That is so like a man." And then she laughed in spite of herself. It sounded so like an echo of Miss Cornelia. "Well, if you won't accept Tennyson as an authority, perhaps you will believe the words of a greater than he," said Gilbert seriously. "'You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free.' I believe that, Anne, with all my heart. It's the greatest and grandest verse in the Bible, or in any literature, and the truest, if there are comparative degrees of trueness. And it's the first duty of a man to tell the truth, as he sees it and believes it." "In this case the truth won't make poor Leslie free," sighed Anne. "It will probably end in still more bitter bondage for her. Oh, Gilbert, I can't think you are right." Chapter 30. Leslie Decides. A sudden outbreak of a virulent type of influenza at the Glen and down at the fishing village kept Gilbert so busy for the next fortnight that he had no time to pay the promised visit to Captain Jim. Anne hoped against hope that he had abandoned the idea about Dick Moore, and resolving to let sleeping dogs lie, she said no more about the subject. But she thought of it incessantly. "I wonder if it would be right for me to tell him that Leslie cares for Owen," she thought. "He would never let her suspect that he knew, so her pride would not suffer, and it might convince him that he should let Dick Moore alone. Shall I? Shall I? No, after all, I cannot. A promise is sacred, and I've no right to betray Leslie's secret. But, oh, I never felt so worried over anything in my life as I do over this. It's spoiling the spring. It's spoiling everything." One evening Gilbert abruptly proposed that they go down and see Captain Jim. With a sinking heart Anne agreed, and they set forth. 2 weeks of kind sunshine had wrought a miracle in the bleak landscape over which Gilbert's crow had flown. The hills and fields were dry and brown and warm, ready to break into bud and blossom. The harbor was laughter-shaken again. The long harbor road was like a gleaming red ribbon. Down on the dunes a crowd of boys, who were out smelt fishing, were burning the thick, dry sandhill grass of the preceding summer. The flames swept over the dunes rosily, flinging their cardinal banners against the dark gulf beyond, and illuminating the channel and the fishing village. It was a picturesque scene which would at other times have delighted Anne's eyes, but she was not enjoying this walk. Neither was Gilbert. Their usual good comradeship and Josephian community of taste and viewpoint were sadly lacking. Anne's disapproval of the whole project showed itself in the haughty uplift of her head and the studied politeness of her remarks. Gilbert's mouth was set in all the Blythe obstinacy, but his eyes were troubled. He meant to do what he believed to be his duty, but to be at outs with Anne was a high price to pay. Altogether they were both glad when they reached the light, and remorseful that they should be glad. Captain Jim put away the fishing net upon which he was working and welcomed them joyfully. In the searching light of the spring evening he looked older than Anne had ever seen him. His hair had grown much grayer, and the strong old hand shook a little. But his blue eyes were clear and steady, and the staunch soul looked out through them gallant and unafraid. Captain Jim listened in amazed silence while Gilbert said what he had come to say. Anne, who knew how the old man worshipped Leslie, felt quite sure that he would side with her, although she had not much hope that this would influence Gilbert. She was therefore surprised beyond measure when Captain Jim, slowly and sorrowfully but unhesitatingly, gave it as his opinion that Leslie should be told. "Oh, Captain Jim, I didn't think you'd say that," she exclaimed reproachfully. "I thought you wouldn't want to make more trouble for her." Captain Jim shook his head. "I don't want to. I know how you feel about it, Mistress Blythe, just as I feel myself. But it ain't our feelings we have to steer by through life. No, no, we'd make shipwreck mighty often if we did that. There's only the one safe compass, and we've got to set our course by that, what it's right to do. I agree with the doctor. If there's a chance for Dick, Leslie should be told of it. There's no two sides to that, in my opinion." "Well," said Anne, giving up in despair, "wait until Miss Cornelia gets after you two men." "Cornelia'll rake us fore and aft, no doubt," assented Captain Jim. "You women are lovely critters, Mistress Blythe, but you're just a mite illogical. You're a highly educated lady, and Cornelia isn't, but you're like as two peas when it comes to that. I don't know as you're any the worse for it. Logic is a sort of hard, merciless thing, I reckon. Now I'll brew up a cup of tea and we'll drink it and talk of pleasant things, just to calm our minds a bit." At least Captain Jim's tea and conversation calmed Anne's mind to such an extent that she did not make Gilbert suffer so acutely on the way home as she had deliberately intended to do. She did not refer to the burning question at all, but she chatted amiably of other matters, and Gilbert understood that he was forgiven under protest. "Captain Jim seems very frail and bent this spring. The winter has aged him," said Anne sadly. "I am afraid that he will soon be going to seek lost Margaret. I can't bear to think of it." "Four Winds won't be the same place when Captain Jim sets out to sea," agreed Gilbert. The following evening he went to the house up the brook. Anne wandered dismally around until his return. "Well, what did Leslie say?" she demanded when he came in. "Very little. I think she felt rather dazed." "And is she going to have the operation?" "She is going to think it over and decide very soon." Gilbert flung himself wearily into the easy chair before the fire. He looked tired. It had not been an easy thing for him to tell Leslie, and the terror that had sprung into her eyes when the meaning of what he had told her came home to her was not a pleasant thing to remember. Now, when the die was cast, he was beset with doubts of his own wisdom. Anne looked at him remorsefully. Then she slipped down on the rug beside him and laid her glossy red head on his arm. "Gilbert, I've been rather hateful over this. I won't be any more. Please just call me red-headed and forgive me." By which Gilbert understood that no matter what came of it, there would be no I-told-you-sos. But he was not wholly comforted. Duty in the abstract is one thing. Duty in the concrete is quite another, especially when the doer is confronted by a woman's stricken eyes. Some instinct made Anne keep away from Leslie for the next 3 days. On the third evening Leslie came down to the little house and told Gilbert that she had made up her mind. She would take Dick to Montreal and have the operation. She was very pale and seemed to have wrapped herself in her old mantle of aloofness, but her eyes had lost the look which had haunted Gilbert. They were cold and bright, and she proceeded to discuss details with him in a crisp, businesslike way. There were plans to be made, and many things to be thought over. When Leslie had got the information she wanted, she went home. Anne wanted to walk part of the way with her. "Better not," said Leslie curtly. "Today's rain has made the ground damp. Good night." "Have I lost my friend?" said Anne with a sigh. "If the operation is successful and Dick Moore finds himself again, Leslie will retreat into some remote fastness of her soul where none of us can ever find her." "Perhaps she will leave him," said Gilbert. "Leslie would never do that, Gilbert. Her sense of duty is very strong. She told me once that her grandmother West always impressed upon her the fact that when she assumed any responsibility she must never shirk it, no matter what the consequences might be. That is one of her cardinal rules. I suppose it's very old-fashioned." "Don't be bitter, Anne girl. You know you don't think it old-fashioned. You know you have the very same idea of sacredness of assumed responsibilities yourself. And you are right. Shirking responsibilities is the curse of our modern life, the secret of all the unrest and discontent that is seething in the world." "Thus saith the preacher," mocked Anne. But under the mockery she felt that he was right, and she was very sick at heart for Leslie. A week later Miss Cornelia descended like an avalanche upon the little house. Gilbert was away, and Anne was compelled to bear the shock of the impact alone. Miss Cornelia hardly waited to get her hat off before she began. "Anne, do you mean to tell me it's true what I've heard, that Dr. Blythe has told Leslie Dick can be cured, and that she is going to take him to Montreal to have him operated on?" "Yes, it is quite true, Miss Cornelia," said Anne bravely. "Well, it's inhuman cruelty, that's what it is," said Miss Cornelia, violently agitated. "I did think Dr. Blythe was a decent man. I didn't think he could have been guilty of this." "Dr. Blythe thought it was his duty to tell Leslie that there was a chance for Dick," said Anne with spirit. "And," she added, loyalty to Gilbert getting the better of her, "I agree with him." "Oh, no, you don't, dearie," said Miss Cornelia. "No person with any bowels of compassion could." "Captain Jim does." "Don't quote that old ninny to me," cried Miss Cornelia, "and I don't care who agrees with him. Think what it means to that poor, hunted, harried girl." "We do think of it. But Gilbert believes that a doctor should put the welfare of a patient's mind and body before all other considerations." "That's just like a man. But I expected better things of you, Anne," said Miss Cornelia, more in sorrow than in wrath. Then she proceeded to bombard Anne with precisely the same arguments with which the latter had attacked Gilbert, and Anne valiantly defended her husband with the weapons he had used for his own protection. Long was the fray, but Miss Cornelia made an end at last. "It's an iniquitous shame," she declared, almost in tears. "That's just what it is, an iniquitous shame. Poor, poor Leslie." "Don't you think Dick should be considered a little too?" pleaded Anne. "Dick? Dick Moore? He's happy enough. He's a better behaved and more reputable member of society now than he ever was before. Why, he was a drunkard and perhaps worse. Are you going to set him loose again to roar and to devour?" "He may reform," said poor Anne, beset by foe without and traitor within. "Reform your grandmother," retorted Miss Cornelia. "Dick Moore got the injuries that left him as he is in a drunken brawl. He deserves his fate. It was sent on him for a punishment. I don't believe the doctor has any business to tamper with the visitations of God." "Nobody knows how Dick was hurt, Miss Cornelia. It may not have been in a drunken brawl at all. He may have been waylaid and robbed." "Pigs may whistle, but they have poor mouths for it," said Miss Cornelia. "Well, the gist of what you tell me is that the thing is settled, and there's no use in talking. If that's so, I'll hold my tongue. I don't propose to wear my teeth out gnawing files. When a thing has to be, I give in to it. But I like to make mighty sure first that it has to be. Now I'll devote my energies to comforting and sustaining Leslie. And after all," added Miss Cornelia, brightening up hopefully, "perhaps nothing can be done for Dick." Chapter 31. The Truth Makes Free. Leslie, having once made up her mind what to do, proceeded to do it with characteristic resolution and speed. House cleaning must be finished with first, whatever issues of life and death might await beyond. The gray house up the brook was put into flawless order and cleanliness, with Miss Cornelia's ready assistance. Miss Cornelia, having said her say to Anne, and later on to Gilbert and Captain Jim, sparing neither of them, let it be assured, never spoke of the matter to Leslie. She accepted the fact of Dick's operation, referred to it when necessary in a businesslike way, and ignored it when it was not. Leslie never attempted to discuss it. She was very cold and quiet during these beautiful spring days. She seldom visited Anne, and though she was invariably courteous and friendly, that very courtesy was an icy barrier between her and the people of the little house. The old jokes and laughter and chumminess of common things could not reach her over it. Anne refused to feel hurt. She knew that Leslie was in the grip of a hideous dread, a dread that wrapped her away from all little glimpses of happiness and hours of pleasure. When one great passion seizes possession of the soul, all other feelings are crowded aside. Never in all her life had Leslie Moore shuddered away from the future with more intolerable terror. But she went forward as unswervingly in the path she had elected as the martyrs of old walked their chosen way, knowing the end of it to be the fiery agony of the stake. The financial question was settled with greater ease than Anne had feared. Leslie borrowed the necessary money from Captain Jim, and at her insistence he took a mortgage on the little farm. "So that is one thing off the poor girl's mind," Miss Cornelia told Anne, "and off mine, too. Now, if Dick gets well enough to work again, he'll be able to earn enough to pay the interest on it, and if he doesn't, I know Captain Jim'll manage some way that Leslie won't have to. He said as much to me. 'I'm getting old, Cornelia,' he said, 'and I've no chick or child of my own. Leslie won't take a gift from a living man, but maybe she will from a dead one. So it will be all right as far as that goes. I wish everything else might be settled as satisfactorily. As for that wretch of a Dick, he's been awful these last few days. The devil was in him, believe me. Leslie and I couldn't get on with our work for the tricks he'd play. He chased all her ducks one day around the yard till most of them died, and not one thing would he do for us. Sometimes, you know, he'll make himself quite handy, bringing in pails of water and wood, but this week if we sent him to the well he'd try to climb down into it. I thought once, if you'd only shoot down there head first, everything would be nicely settled." "Oh, Miss Cornelia." Now, you needn't Miss Cornelia me, Anne dearie. Anybody would have thought the same. If the Montreal doctors can make a rational creature out of Dick Moore, they're wonders." Leslie took Dick to Montreal early in May. Gilbert went with her to help her and make the necessary arrangements for her. He came home with the report that the Montreal surgeon whom they had consulted agreed with him that there was a good chance of Dick's restoration. "Very comforting," was Miss Cornelia's sarcastic comment. Anne only sighed. Leslie had been very distant at their parting. But she had promised to write. 10 days after Gilbert's return the letter came. Leslie wrote that the operation had been successfully performed and that Dick was making a good recovery. "What does she mean by successfully?" asked Anne. "Does she mean that Dick's memory is really restored?" "Not likely, since she says nothing of it," said Gilbert. "She uses the word successfully from the surgeon's point of view. The operation has been performed and followed by normal results. But it is too soon to know whether Dick's faculties will be eventually restored, wholly or in part. His memory would not be likely to return to him all at once. The process will be gradual, if it occurs at all. Is that all she says?" "Yes, there's her letter. It's very short. Poor girl, she must be under a terrible strain. Gilbert Blythe, there are heaps of things I long to say to you, only it would be mean." "Miss Cornelia says them for you," said Gilbert with a rueful smile. "She combs me down every time I encounter her. She makes it plain to me that she regards me as little better than a murderer, and that she thinks it a great pity that Dr. Dave ever let me step into his shoes. She even told me that the Methodist doctor over the harbor was to be preferred before me. With Miss Cornelia the force of condemnation can no further go." "If Cornelia Bryant was sick, it would not be Dr. Dave or the Methodist doctor she would send for," sniffed Susan. "She would have you out of your hard-earned bed in the middle of the night, doctor dear, if she took a spell of misery, that she would. And then she would likely say your bill was past all reason. But do not mind her, doctor dear. It takes all kinds of people to make a world." No further word came from Leslie for some time. The May days crept away in a sweet succession, and the shores of Four Winds Harbor greened and bloomed and purpled. One day in late May Gilbert came home to be met by Susan in the stable yard. "I'm afraid something has upset Mrs. Doctor, doctor dear," she said mysteriously. "She got a letter this afternoon, and since then she has just been walking round the garden and talking to herself. You know it is not good for her to be on her feet so much, doctor dear. She did not see fit to tell me what her news was, and I am no pry, doctor dear, and never was, but it is plain something has upset her, and it is not good for her to be upset." Gilbert hurried rather anxiously to the garden. Had anything happened at Green Gables? But Anne, sitting on the rustic seat by the brook, did not look troubled, though she was certainly much excited. Her eyes were their grayest, and scarlet spots burned on her cheeks. "What has happened, Anne?" Anne gave a queer little laugh. "I think you'll hardly believe it when I tell you, Gilbert. I can't believe it yet. As Susan said the other day, I feel like a fly coming to live in the sun, dazed like. It's all so incredible. I've read the letter a score of times, and every time it's just the same. I can't believe my own eyes. Oh, Gilbert, you were right, so right. I can see that clearly enough now. And I'm so ashamed of myself. And will you ever really forgive me?" "Anne, I'll shake you if you don't grow coherent. Redmond would be ashamed of you. What has happened?" "You won't believe it. You won't believe it." "I'm going to phone for Uncle Dave," said Gilbert, pretending to start for the house. "Sit down, Gilbert. I'll try to tell you. I've had a letter. And oh, Gilbert, it's all so amazing, so incredibly amazing. We never thought, not one of us ever dreamed." "I suppose," said Gilbert, sitting down with a resigned air, "the only thing to do in a case of this kind is to have patience and go at the matter categorically. Whom is your letter from?" "Leslie. And oh, Gilbert." "Leslie? Phew! What is she to say? What's the news about Dick?" Anne lifted the letter and held it out, calmly dramatic in a moment. "There is no Dick. The man we have thought Dick Moore, whom everybody in Four Winds has believed for 12 years to be Dick Moore, is his cousin, George Moore of Nova Scotia, who, it seems, always resembled him very strikingly. Dick Moore died of yellow fever 13 years ago in Cuba." Chapter 32. Miss Cornelia discusses the affair. "And do you mean to tell me, Anne dearie, that Dick Moore has turned out not to be Dick Moore at all, but somebody else? Is that what you phoned up to me today?" "Yes, Miss Cornelia. It's very amazing, isn't it?" It's just like a man," said Miss Cornelia helplessly. She took off her hat with trembling fingers. For once in her life Miss Cornelia was undeniably staggered. "I can't seem to sense it, Anne," she said. "I've heard you say it, and I believe you, but I can't take it in. Dick Moore is dead, has been dead all these years, and Leslie is free." "Yes, the truth has made her free. Gilbert was right when he said that verse was the grandest in the Bible." "Tell me everything, Anne dearie. Since I got your phone I've been in a regular muddle, believe me. Cornelia Bryant was never so kerflummoxed before." "There isn't a very great deal to tell. Leslie's letter was short. She didn't go into particulars. This man, George Moore, has recovered his memory and knows who he is. He says Dick took yellow fever in Cuba and the four sisters had to sail without him. George stayed behind to nurse him, but he died very shortly afterwards. George did not write Leslie because he intended to come right home and tell her himself." "And why didn't he?" "I suppose his accident must have intervened. Gilbert says it is quite likely that George Moore remembers nothing of his accident or what led to it, and may never remember it. It probably happened very soon after Dick's death. We may find out more particulars when Leslie writes again." "Does she say what she is going to do, when she is coming home?" "She says she will stay with George Moore until he can leave the hospital. She has written to his people in Nova Scotia. It seems that George's only near relative is a married sister much older than himself. She was living when George sailed on the Four Sisters, but of course we do not know what may have happened since." "Did you ever see George Moore, Miss Cornelia?" "I did. It is all coming back to me. He was here visiting his Uncle Abner 18 years ago, when he and Dick would be about 17. They were double cousins, you see. Their fathers were brothers and their mothers were twin sisters, and they did look a terrible lot alike. Of course," added Miss Cornelia scornfully, "it wasn't one of those freak resemblances you read of in novels, where two people are so much alike they can fill each other's places, and their nearest and dearest can't tell between them. In those days you could tell easy enough which was George and which was Dick, if you saw them together and near at hand. Apart or some distance away it wasn't so easy. They played lots of tricks on people and thought it great fun, the two scamps. George Moore was a little taller and a good deal fatter than Dick, though neither of them was what you would call fat. They were both of the lean kind. Dick had higher color than George, and his hair was a shade lighter, but their features were just alike, and they both had that queer freak of eyes, one blue and one hazel. They weren't much alike in any other way, though. George was a real nice fellow, though he was a scallywag for mischief, and some said he had a liking for a glass even then. But everybody liked him better than Dick. He spent about a month here. Leslie never saw him. She was only about 8 or 9 then, and I remember now that she spent that whole winter over harbor with her grandmother West. Captain Jim was away, too. That was the winter he was wrecked on the Magdalens. I don't suppose either he or Leslie had ever heard about the Nova Scotia cousin looking so much like Dick. Nobody ever thought of him when Captain Jim brought George, I should say, home. Of course, we all thought Dick had changed considerable. He'd got so lumpish and fat, but we put that down to what had happened to him, and no doubt that was the reason, for as I've said, George wasn't fat to begin with either. And there was no other way we could have guessed, for the man's senses were clean gone. I can't see that it is any wonder we were all deceived. But it is a staggering thing. And Leslie has sacrificed the best years of her life to nursing a man who hadn't any claim on her. Oh, drat the men. No matter what they do, it's the wrong thing, and no matter who they are, it's somebody they shouldn't be. They do exasperate me." "Gilbert and Captain Jim are men, and it is through them that the truth has been discovered at last," said Anne. "Well, I admit that," conceded Miss Cornelia reluctantly. "I'm sorry I raked the doctor off so. It's the first time in my life I've ever felt ashamed of anything I said to a man. I don't know as I shall tell him so, though. He'll just have to take it for granted. Well, Anne dearie, it's a mercy the Lord doesn't answer all our prayers. I've been praying hard right along that the operation wouldn't cure Dick. Of course, I didn't put it just quite so plain, but that was what was in the back of my mind, and I have no doubt the Lord knew it." "Well, he has answered the spirit of your prayer. You really wished that things shouldn't be made any harder for Leslie. I'm afraid that in my secret heart I've been hoping the operation wouldn't succeed, and I'm wholesomely ashamed of it." "How does Leslie seem to take it?" She writes like one dazed. I think that, like ourselves, she hardly realizes it yet. She says, "It all seems like a strange dream to me, Anne." That is the only reference she makes to herself. Poor child. I suppose when the chains are struck off a prisoner he'd feel queer and lost without them for a while. Anne, dearie, here's a thought keeps coming into my mind. What about Owen Ford? We both know Leslie was fond of him. Did it ever occur to you that he was fond of her? It did once, admitted Anne, feeling that she might say so much. Well, I hadn't any reason to think he was, but it just appeared to me he must be. Now, Anne dearie, the Lord knows I'm not a matchmaker, and I scorn all such things. But if I were you and writing to that Ford man, I'd just mention casual like what has happened. That is what I'd do. Of course I will mention it when I write to him, said Anne a trifle distantly. Somehow this was a thing she could not discuss with Miss Cornelia. And yet she had to admit that the same thought had been lurking in her mind ever since she had heard of Leslie's freedom. But she would not desecrate it by free speech. Of course there is no great rush, dearie. But Dick Moore's been dead for 13 years, and Leslie has wasted enough of her life for him. We'll just see what comes of it. As for this George Moore, who's gone and come back to life when everyone thought he was dead and done for, just like a man, I'm real sorry for him. He won't seem to fit in anywhere. He is still a young man, and if he recovers completely, as seems likely, he will be able to make a place for himself again. It must be very strange for him, poor fellow. I suppose all these years since his accident will not exist for him. Chapter 33. Leslie Returns. A fortnight later Leslie Moore came home alone to the old house where she had spent so many bitter years. In the June twilight she went over the fields to Anne's and appeared with ghost-like suddenness in the scented garden. "Leslie!" cried Anne in amazement. "Where have you sprung from? We never knew you were coming. Why didn't you write? We would have met you." "I couldn't write somehow, Anne. It seemed so futile to try to say anything with pen and ink. And I wanted to get back quietly and unobserved." Anne put her arms about Leslie and kissed her. Leslie returned the kiss warmly. She looked pale and tired, and she gave a little sigh as she dropped down on the grasses beside a great bed of daffodils that were gleaming through the pale, silvery twilight like golden stars. "And have you come home alone, Leslie?" "Yes. George Moore's sister came to Montreal and took him home with her. Poor fellow, he was sorry to part with me, though I was a stranger to him when his memory first came back. He clung to me in those first hard days when he was trying to realize that Dick's death was not the thing of yesterday that it seemed to him. It was all very hard for him. I helped him all I could. When his sister came it was easier for him, because it seemed to him only the other day that he had seen her last. Fortunately she had not changed much, and that helped him too." "It is all so strange and wonderful, Leslie. I think we none of us realize it yet." "I cannot. When I went into the house over there an hour ago, I felt that it must be a dream, that Dick must be there, with his childish smile, as he had been for so long. And I seem stunned yet. I'm not glad or sorry or anything. I feel as if something had been torn suddenly out of my life and left a terrible hole. I feel as if I couldn't be I, as if I must have changed into somebody else and couldn't get used to it. It gives me a horrible, lonely, dazed, helpless feeling. It's good to see you again. It seems as if you were a sort of anchor for my drifting soul. Oh, Anne, I dread it all, the gossip and wonderment and questioning. When I think of that, I wish that I need not have come home at all. Dr. Dave was at the station when I came off the train. He brought me home. Poor old man. He feels very badly because he told me years ago that nothing could be done for Dick. 'I honestly thought so, Leslie,' he said to me today. 'But I should have told you not to depend on my opinion. I should have told you to go to a specialist. If I had, you would have been saved many bitter years, and poor George Moore many wasted ones. I blame myself very much, Leslie.' I told him not to do that. He had done what he thought right. He has always been so kind to me. I couldn't bear to see him worrying over it." "And Dick, George, I mean, is his memory fully restored?" "Practically. Of course, there are a great many details he can't recall yet, but he remembers more and more every day. He went out for a walk on the evening after Dick was buried. He had Dick's money and watch on him. He meant to bring them home to me, along with my letter. He admits he went to a place where the sailors resorted, and he remembers drinking, and nothing else. Anne, I shall never forget the moment he remembered his own name. I saw him looking at me with an intelligent but puzzled expression. I said, 'Do you know me, Dick?' He answered, 'I never saw you before. Who are you? And my name's not Dick. I'm George Moore, and Dick died of yellow fever yesterday. Where am I? What has happened to me?' I fainted, Anne, and ever since I have felt as if I were in a dream." "You will soon adjust yourself to this new state of things, Leslie. And you are young. Life is before you. You will have many beautiful years yet." "Perhaps I shall be able to look at it in that way after a while, Anne. Just now I feel too tired and indifferent to think about the future. I'm Anne, I'm lonely. I miss Dick. Isn't it all very strange? Do you know, I was really fond of poor Dick. George, I suppose I should say, just as I would have been fond of a helpless child who depended on me for everything. I would never have admitted it. I was really ashamed of it, because, you see, I had hated and despised Dick so much before he went away. When I heard that Captain Jim was bringing him home, I expected I would just feel the same to him. But I never did, although I continued to loathe him as I remembered him before. From the time he came home, I felt only pity, a pity that hurt and wrung me. I supposed then that it was just because his accident had made him so helpless and changed. But now I believe it was because there was really a different personality there. Carlo knew it, Anne. I know now that Carlo knew it. I always thought it strange that Carlo shouldn't have known Dick. Dogs are usually so faithful. But he knew it was not his master who had come back, although none of the rest of us did. I had never seen George Moore, you know. I remember now that Dick once mentioned casually that he had a cousin in Nova Scotia who looked as much like him as a twin. But the thing had gone out of my memory, and in any case I would never have thought it of any importance. You see, it never occurred to me to question Dick's identity. Any change in him seemed to me just the result of the accident. Oh, Anne, that night in April when Gilbert told me he thought Dick might be cured, I can never forget it. It seemed to me that I had once been a prisoner in a hideous cage of torture, and then the door had been opened and I could get out. I was still chained to the cage, but I was not in it. And that night I felt that a merciless hand was drawing me back into the cage, back to a torture even more terrible than it had once been. I didn't blame Gilbert. I felt he was right. And he had been very good. He said that if, in view of the expense and uncertainty of the operation, I should decide not to risk it, he would not blame me in the least. But I knew how I ought to decide, and I couldn't face it. All night I walked the floor like a madwoman, trying to compel myself to face it. I couldn't, Anne. I thought I couldn't. And when morning broke, I set my teeth and resolved that I wouldn't. I would let things remain as they were. It was very wicked, I know. It would have been just punishment for such wickedness if I had been left to abide by that decision. I kept to it all that day. That afternoon I had to go up to the Glen to do some shopping. It was one of Dick's quiet, drowsy days, so I left him alone. I was gone a little longer than I had expected, and he missed me. He felt lonely, and when I got home he ran to meet me just like a child, with such a pleased smile on his face. Somehow, Anne, I just gave way then. That smile on his poor vacant face was more than I could endure. I felt as if I were denying a child the chance to grow and develop. I knew that I must give him his chance, no matter what the consequences might be. So I came over and told Gilbert. Oh, Anne, you must have thought me hateful in those weeks before I went away. I didn't mean to be, but I couldn't think of anything except what I had to do, and everything and everybody about me were like shadows. I know. I understood, Leslie. And now it is all over. Your chain is broken. There is no cage." "There is no cage," repeated Leslie absently, plucking at the fringing grasses with her slender brown hands. "But it doesn't seem as if there were anything else, Anne. You remember what I told you of my folly that night on the sandbar. I find one doesn't get over being a fool very quickly. Sometimes I think there are people who are fools forever. And to be a fool of that kind is almost as bad as being a dog on a chain." "You will feel very differently after you get over being tired and bewildered," said Anne, who, knowing a certain thing that Leslie did not know, did not feel herself called upon to waste overmuch sympathy. Leslie laid her splendid golden head against Anne's knee. "Anyhow, I have you," she said. "Life can't be altogether empty with such a friend. Anne, pat my head, just as if I were a little girl. Mother me a bit, and let me tell you while my stubborn tongue is loosed a little, just what you and your comradeship have meant to me since that night I met you on the rock shore." Chapter 34. The Ship o' Dreams Comes to Harbor. One morning, when a windy golden sunrise was billowing over the gulf in waves of light, a certain weary stork flew over the bar of Four Winds Harbor on his way from the land of evening stars. Under his wing was tucked a sleepy, starry-eyed little creature. The stork was tired, and he looked wistfully about him. He knew he was somewhere near his destination, but he could not yet see it. The big white lighthouse on the red sandstone cliff had its good points, but no stork possessed of any gumption would leave a new velvet baby there. An old gray house surrounded by willows in a blossomy brook valley looked more promising, but did not seem quite the thing either. The staring green abode further on was manifestly out of the question. Then the stork brightened up. He had caught sight of the very place, a little white house nestled against a big whispering fir wood, with a spiral of blue smoke winding up from its kitchen chimney, a house which just looked as if it were meant for babies. The stork gave a sigh of satisfaction and softly alighted on the ridgepole. Half an hour later Gilbert ran down the hall and tapped on the spare room door. A drowsy voice answered him, and in a moment Marilla's pale, scared face peeped out from behind the door. "Marilla, Anne has sent me to tell you that a certain young gentleman has arrived here. He hasn't brought much luggage with him, but he evidently means to stay." "For pity's sake," said Marilla blankly. "You don't mean to tell me, Gilbert, that it's all over? Why wasn't I called?" "Anne wouldn't let us disturb you when there was no need. Nobody was called until about 2 hours ago. There was no passage perilous this time." And Gilbert, will this baby live?" "He certainly will. He weighs 10 pounds. And why, listen to him. Nothing wrong with his lungs, is there? The nurse says his hair will be red. Anne is furious with her, and I'm tickled to death." That was a wonderful day in the little house of dreams. "The best dream of all has come true," said Anne, pale and rapturous. "Oh, Marilla, I hardly dare believe it after that horrible day last summer. I have had a heartache ever since then, but it is gone now." "This baby will take Joy's place," said Marilla. "Oh, no, 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 Marilla. He can't. Nothing can ever do that. He has his own place, my dear, wee man-child. But little Joy has hers, and always will have it. If she had lived, she would have been over a year old. She would have been toddling around on her tiny feet and lisping a few words. I can see her so plainly, Marilla. Oh, I know now that Captain Jim was right when he said God would manage better than that my baby would seem a stranger to me when I found her beyond. I've learned that this past year. I've followed her development day by day and week by week. I always shall. I shall know just how she grows from year to year, and when I meet her again I'll know her. She won't be a stranger. Oh, Marilla, look at his dear, darling toes. Isn't it strange that they should be so perfect?" "It would be stranger if they weren't," said Marilla crisply. Now that all was safely over, Marilla was herself again. "Oh, I know. But it seems as if they couldn't be quite finished, you know. And they are, even to the tiny nails. And his hands. Just look at his hands, Marilla." "They appear to be a good deal like hands," Marilla conceded. "See how he clings to my finger. I'm sure he knows me already. He cries when the nurse takes him away. Oh, Marilla, you don't think, do you, that his hair is going to be red?" "I don't see much hair of any color," said Marilla. "I wouldn't worry about it if I were you until it becomes visible." "Marilla, he has hair. Look at that fine little down all over his head. Anyway, nurse says his eyes will be hazel, and his forehead is exactly like Gilbert's." "And he has the nicest little ears, Mrs. Doctor dear," said Susan. "The first thing I did was look at his ears. Hair is deceitful, and noses and eyes change, and you cannot tell what is going to come of them. But ears is ears from start to finish, and you always know where you are with them. Just look at their shape, and they are set right back against his precious head. You will never need to be ashamed of his ears, Mrs. Doctor, dear." Anne's convalescence was rapid and happy. Folks came and worshipped the baby, as people have bowed before the kingship of the newborn since long before the wise men of the East knelt in homage to the royal babe of the Bethlehem manger. Leslie, slowly finding herself amid the new conditions of her life, hovered over it, like a beautiful golden-crowned Madonna. Miss Cornelia nursed it as knackily as could any mother in Israel. Captain Jim held the small creature in his big brown hands and gazed tenderly at it, with eyes that saw the children who had never been born to him. "What are you going to call him?" asked Miss Cornelia. "Anne has settled his name," answered Gilbert. "James Matthew, after the two finest gentlemen I've ever known, not even saving your presence," said Anne with a saucy glance at Gilbert. Gilbert smiled. "I never knew Matthew very well. He was so shy we boys couldn't get acquainted with him. But I quite agree with you that Captain Jim is one of the rarest and finest souls God ever clothed in clay. He is so delighted over the fact that we have given his name to our small lad. It seems he has no other namesake." "Well, James Matthew is a name that will wear well and not fade in the washing," said Miss Cornelia. "I'm glad you didn't load him down with some highfalutin romantic name that he'd be ashamed of when he gets to be a grandfather. Mrs. William Drew at the Glen has called her baby Bertie Shakespeare. Quite a combination, isn't it? And I'm glad you haven't had much trouble picking on a name. Some folks have an awful time. When the Stanley Flagg's first boy was born there was so much rivalry as to who the child should be named for that the poor little soul had to go for 2 years without a name. Then a brother came along, and there it was, Big Baby and Little Baby. Finally they called Big Baby Peter and Little Baby Isaac, after the two grandfathers, and had them both christened together. And each tried to see if it couldn't howl the other down. You know that Highland Scotch family of McNabbs back of the Glen? They've got 12 boys, and the oldest and the youngest are both called Neil. Big Neil and Little Neil in the same family. Well, I suppose they ran out of names." "I have read somewhere," laughed Anne, "that the first child is a poem, but the 10th is very prosy prose. Perhaps Mrs. McNabb thought that the 12th was merely an old tale retold." "Well, there's something to be said for large families," said Miss Cornelia with a sigh. "I was an only child for 8 years, and I did long for a brother and sister. Mother told me to pray for one, and pray I did, believe me. Well, one day Aunt Nellie came to me and said, 'Cornelia, there is a little brother for you upstairs in your ma's room. You can go up and see him.' I was so excited and delighted I just flew upstairs, and old Mrs. Flagg lifted up the baby for me to see. Lord, Anne dearie, I never was so disappointed in my life. You see, I'd been praying for a brother 2 years older than myself." "How long did it take you to get over your disappointment?" asked Anne amid her laughter. "Well, I had a spite at Providence for a good spell, and for weeks I wouldn't even look at the baby. Nobody knew why, for I never told. Then he began to get real cute and held out his wee hands to me, and I began to get fond of him. But I didn't get really reconciled to him until one day a school chum came to see him and said she thought he was awful small for his age. I just got boiling mad and sailed right into her and told her she didn't know a nice baby when she saw one, and ours was the nicest baby in the world. And after that I just worshipped him. Mother died before he was 3 years old, and I was sister and mother to him both. Poor little lad, he was never strong, and he died when he wasn't much over 20. Seems to me I'd have given anything on earth, Anne dearie, if he'd only lived." Miss Cornelia sighed. Gilbert had gone down, and Leslie, who had been crooning over the small James Matthew in the dormer window, laid him asleep in his basket and went her way. As soon as she was safely out of earshot, Miss Cornelia bent forward and said in a conspirator's whisper, "Anne dearie, I'd a letter from Owen Ford yesterday. He's in Vancouver just now, but he wants to know if I can board him for a month later on. You know what that means. Well, I hope we're doing right." "We've nothing to do with it. We couldn't prevent him from coming to Four Winds if he wanted to," said Anne quickly. She did not like the feeling of matchmaking Miss Cornelia's whispers gave her, and then she weakly succumbed herself. "Don't let Leslie know he is coming until he is here," she said. "If she found out, I feel sure she would go away at once. She intends to go in the fall anyhow. She told me so the other day. She is going to Montreal to take up nursing and make what she can of her life." "Oh, well, Anne dearie," said Miss Cornelia, nodding sagely, "that is all as it may be. You and I have done our part, and we must leave the rest to higher hands."